In December 1941, history remembers Pearl Harbor as the moment America entered the war. But that's wrong. America entered the war in 33 minutes. In those 33 minutes, Japan didn't merely gain an enemy. It shattered the invisible framework its leaders had spent years building in their own minds. The assumptions that had made the attack seem inevitable, even elegant, collapsed faster than any battleship could sink. Not because American power was greater than expected, but because it had never been absent at all. The most dangerous mistake in war is not underestimating strength. It is mistaking restraint for weakness. The silence that followed that realization did not come immediately. It came later, after the radios went quiet, after the cables stopped arriving in celebratory bursts, after the certainty drained from rooms that had once echoed with confidence. And then Japan moved forward anyway because by then it had no choice. Long before the first aircraft lifted off carrier decks, the war had already been rehearsed in conference rooms thick with cigarette smoke and certainty. Men in uniform stood before maps of the Pacific, tracing arcs of advance with bamboo pointers, explaining distances as if geography itself could be persuaded to cooperate. They spoke not just of fuel and tonnage, but of character, of temperament, of what kind of nation America was supposed to be. They said democracy could not move quickly, that it argued with itself until opportunity passed, that its people, softened by prosperity, would recoil from sacrifice. Comfort, they believed, dulled resolve. Debate weakened will. Freedom made decisions impossible. Those ideas hardened into doctrine. They appeared in intelligence summaries, in briefing notes, in the margins of war plans. Every report that confirmed them was underlined. Every report that contradicted them was qualified, softened, or quietly set aside. America's factories were large, yes, but inefficient without direction. Its politics were loud, but incapable of unity. Its people were energetic, but only when stirred slowly, reluctantly. This was not ignorance. It was something more dangerous. It was coherence built on desire. In a narrow office overlooking Tokyo, a junior intelligence officer once hesitated before submitting a cable translation. The words troubled him. The American source described industrial readiness not as potential, but as dormancy. Capacity already built. Systems already tested. Waiting. He rewrote the phrasing twice before sending it upward, careful to dull the implication. He told himself he was being precise, not cautious. That exaggeration helped no one. Across the city, in rooms far above ground, senior men spoke with confidence about time. Time was the essential variable. Weeks of debate, months of hesitation, a year, perhaps more, before America could organize itself into something dangerous. Time to secure resources, time to build defenses, time to make intervention feel futile. Time was the foundation beneath everything. When doubts surfaced, they were handled politely. A naval officer who had studied in America warned that restraint was a choice, not a limitation. That Americans did not lack will, they rationed it. His caution was acknowledged, then filed under personality. He had lived there too long, they said. He had mistaken familiarity for insight. Belief hardened into certainty through repetition. By the autumn of 1941, the idea that America could not respond decisively was no longer debated. It was assumed, and assumptions, once embedded, stop feeling like assumptions at all. They feel like facts. The attack, when it came, was devastating. Reports arrived describing burning ships, shattered aircraft, confusion rippling through the harbor. The room that received the early confirmations reacted exactly as expected. Nods, controlled satisfaction, a sense that history had been nudged just slightly in the correct direction. No one celebrated. That would have been unseemly, but the relief was unmistakable. The model had worked. America had been struck hard, and now it would do what democracies were supposed to do. Argue, hesitate, fracture. Then the message arrived. It was short, administrative, almost banal. Numbers, votes, time elapsed, 33 minutes. First, it didn't register. Someone asked for clarification, assuming an error in transmission or translation. Another leaned closer to the paper, tracing the figures with a finger as if proximity might change them. 33 minutes from presidential address to declaration. Near unanimity. No prolonged debate. No delay. The room did not erupt. It was hollow. What unsettled them was not speed alone, but what speed implied. Debate had not slowed the decision. It had preceded it. The arguments had already been resolved, quietly, privately, before the public moment arrived. What they were witnessing was not democracy struggling to act, but democracy finishing deliberation. In that realization, the belief that had started the war cracked cleanly in two. Comfort had not softened America. It had preserved it. Debate had not weakened resolve. It had focused on it. Restraint had not been incapacity. It had been a choice. The men who understood this first felt no triumph in the insight. Only a cold recognition that the war they had planned was not the war that now existed. Somewhere beyond the Pacific, a vast system had shifted from waiting to moving, from arguing to deciding. And once that shift occurred, there would be no return to silence. The message arrived at 2:47 a.m. Tokyo time, slipping into the underground communications center beneath Imperial General Headquarters without ceremony. It did not carry the tone of a threat. It did not explain itself. It did not justify or persuade. It simply stated what had already been done. 11 words, translated carefully, written neatly on a narrow strip of paper. United States Congress vote complete. Declaration of war approved. First, no one spoke. The room was crowded with officers, aides, technicians. Men who had been awake for nearly 20 hours, sustained by adrenaline and certainty. Maps still glowed under electric lights. Radios hummed softly. The atmosphere had been tense, but controlled. This was the moment they had expected to mark transition, from attack to negotiation, from shock to paralysis. Instead, the decoder hesitated. There were numbers that followed the words. Votes, tallies. Time elapsed. The pause stretched just long enough to feel wrong. Read it again, someone said quietly. The decoder swallowed and read the figures aloud. The House, the Senate. The margins were overwhelming. One dissenting vote in the lower chamber. None in the upper. Near unanimity, achieved not after weeks of wrangling, but after a single speech. Then came the final line. Total elapsed time, 33 minutes. For a moment it sounded like a mistranslation. 33 minutes was not a political process. It was a mechanical one, procedural anomaly. Someone laughed softly, not out of humor, but disbelief. Another leaned over the table, scanning the paper as though the numbers might rearrange themselves under scrutiny. 33 minutes meant no prolonged debate, no visible fracture, no internal resistance strong enough to slow momentum. It meant that the arguments Japan had counted on had already been settled, silently, decisively, before the vote was ever called. The shock did not arrive as panic. It arrived as disorientation. Men who had spent years studying American politics felt suddenly unmoored. Their mental timelines collapsed. The carefully plotted sequence, attack, confusion, debate, delay, had skipped directly to resolution. Not resolution toward peace, but toward commitment. One officer whispered the number again, as if repeating it might make it smaller. 33 minutes. In the bunker, time itself seemed to warp. The clocks on the wall ticked on, indifferent, but the sense of scale had been destroyed. Weeks vanished. Months evaporated. The future compressed violently into the present. A senior aide finally spoke, his voice flat. That is faster than any democracy in recorded history. No one corrected him. What made the moment unbearable was not the declaration of war. That had always been expected. What broke the room was what the declaration revealed. America had not needed persuasion. It needed permission. And that permission, once granted, had been accepted instantly. The floor had not collapsed beneath them. It had simply disappeared. By dawn, the second rupture became impossible to ignore. What Japan had expected to linger, fractured opinion, public hesitation, political resistance, did not weaken slowly or negotiate its exit. It vanished. almost completely, and it did so with a speed that felt unnatural, as if something essential had been switched off overnight. Cables began arriving from diplomatic observers in Washington, New York, Chicago. Their tone was uncertain, almost confused. Reports contradicted months of carefully gathered intelligence. Organizations that had dominated headlines only days earlier were suddenly absent. Not diminished, not challenged, gone. The America First Committee, the centerpiece of American isolationism, formally dissolved itself within hours of the attack. No prolonged statement, no internal struggle aired in public. Just a brief announcement and silence. Offices closed, meetings canceled. The movement that Japanese planners had counted on to slow, divide, and obstruct American response evaporated without protest. More unsettling still were the individual reversals. Men who had built careers opposing intervention issued statements pledging total support for the war effort. Senators who had warned against foreign entanglements spoke now of unity and obligation. Their words were not defensive. They were resolute, as if resistance itself had become irrelevant. And then came the name that froze the room. Charles Lindbergh. For months, his speeches had been cited in Japanese intelligence briefings as evidence of deep American division. He was the symbol of isolationist conviction, the proof that public opinion could not be unified quickly. When his statement arrived, it was read twice before anyone trusted it. He volunteered for military service. Not reluctantly, not conditionally. He framed the war as unavoidable, the moment as decisive, and national unity as non-negotiable. There was no bitterness in his words, no sense of defeat, only acceptance. That detail unsettled the planners more than any vote tally. If even the most prominent opponents had fallen silent or worse, aligned, then the internal breaks Japan had relied upon were not just failing. They had been removed entirely. Debate had not been overcome. It had been rendered obsolete. Inside the bunker, someone remarked that this was emotional response. Shock would fade. Reality would assert itself. Casualties would reopen divisions. But the reports kept coming. Labor unions suspended strike actions without negotiation. Factory owners requested permission to convert to round-the-clock production before being asked. Newspapers stopped framing the war as a policy question and began treating it as a shared obligation. Language shifted. Tone hardened. What Japan had mistaken for ideological division revealed itself to be conditional restraint. The arguments had existed, but only while peace was still an option. Once that option disappeared, so did the arguments. This was not polarization resolving itself. It was something rarer. A society aligning not through force, but through consensus formed faster than any intelligence model had predicted. For the first time since the message arrived, a quiet fear settled into the room. Not of American anger, but of American coherence. This wasn't normal history. Democracies weren't supposed to do this. They weren't supposed to move as one. They weren't supposed to close ranks so completely, so quickly, that opposition itself dissolved without a struggle. Yet that was exactly what was happening. And in that disappearance of debate, Japan began to understand that it had not awakened chaos. It had awakened focus. The transcript arrived folded, creased from hurried handling. The original English text carried up from the Foreign Ministry's monitoring station and placed carefully on the table. Until that moment, everything Japan knew of the American president's address had come through summaries and translations. Paraphrased, softened, interpreted. This was different. The Prime Minister read slowly, tracing each line with his finger, sounding out phrases in a language he understood well enough to recognize tone. The room remained silent. The kind of silence reserved for moments when no one wants to interrupt what is already becoming irreversible. The first sentence stopped him. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941. A date which will live in infamy. Not might live. Not could live. Will live. The certainty of it was unsettling. Roosevelt was not persuading Congress or preparing the public. He was declaring judgment, as though history itself had already spoken and he was merely repeating the verdict. The phrase did not invite debate, closed it. The speech did not wander. There were no philosophical digressions, no careful acknowledgments of opposing views, no language designed to soothe or reconcile. Roosevelt did not ask Americans to consider war. He informed them that it existed. Hostilities exist. The words appeared without drama, placed like a legal finding rather than an emotional appeal. There was no hesitation in the phrasing, no suggestion that alternatives remained on the table. The speech moved forward with deliberate restraint, cataloging attacks one by one: Pearl Harbor, Malaya, Hong Kong, the Philippines, each location a separate charge, each mention tightening the scope of inevitability. What frightened the men reading it was not what Roosevelt said, but what he refused to say. There was no mention of negotiation, no hint that diplomatic channels remained open, no language suggesting limited aims or conditional outcomes. Peace was not framed as something to be restored, but as something that had already been broken beyond repair. Then came the line that sealed it: absolute victory. Not victory at acceptable cost. Not victory through compromise. Absolute. The word sat on the page with unsettling finality. Democracies were supposed to hedge. They were supposed to leave room for adjustment, for coalition politics, for changing public mood. This speech did none of that. It spoke as though endurance itself were not in question, as though the American people were a fixed resource to be deployed until the outcome was achieved. There was no anger in the speech, no emotional excess. Roosevelt's tone was calm, measured, almost surgical. That was what made it dangerous. Rage burned hot and fast. Certainty burned long. Someone in the room finally spoke, barely above a whisper. He's not rallying them. No one disagreed. Roosevelt was not convincing Americans to fight. He was preparing them to endure. He was telling them that the road ahead would be long, and that the destination was non-negotiable. The speech did not raise questions. It answered them in advance. In that moment, democracy revealed itself differently than Japan had imagined. Not as a chaotic chorus of competing voices, but as a system capable of deciding, and then speaking with one voice once the decision was made. The door to debate had not been slammed shut. It had been locked quietly, with no intention of reopening. By the time the next wave of reports arrived, the idea that America needed time to build strength had already begun to feel naive. The first cables spoke of cancellations. Civilian contracts suspended without government orders. Aircraft manufacturers halting commercial work overnight. Shipyards shifting schedules before any formal directive had been issued. At first glance, it looked like chaos. But as the pattern sharpened, something else became clear. This wasn't improvisation. It was activation. The factories already existed. They were not being constructed, expanded, or invented. They were being repurposed. Assembly lines that had produced automobiles hours earlier were being cleared, measured, and retooled with an efficiency that suggested rehearsal rather than panic. The machinery was familiar. The workforce was trained. The systems had been waiting. Japanese planners had imagined American industry as potential vast, yes, but inert without political coordination. What they were witnessing instead was latent capability snapping into alignment the moment restraint was removed. No one was teaching these factories how to produce at scale. They had been doing it for decades. Reports from the West Coast were especially unsettling. Boeing canceled civilian orders and redirected materials within a single day. Douglas aircraft began operating around the clock. Floodlights installed almost immediately. Ford halted automobile production and contacted the War Department not to ask what was needed, but to offer capacity. They were not waiting to be told what to do. That detail mattered more than any production figure. It revealed that American industry did not require centralized coercion to mobilize. It required a shared signal. Once that signal arrived, coordination emerged organically, driven by systems that already knew how to move fast. The language in the intelligence summaries began to shift. Words like conversion replaced preparation. Acceleration replaced transition. Estimates that had once been measured in months were revised into weeks, then days. What Japan had believed was American industrial weakness was revealed to be deliberate idleness. Capacity had not been absent. It had been restrained, kept in reserve by a society unwilling to unleash it without cause. Pearl Harbor provided that cause. The attack did not force America to invent new power. It gave permission to release what already existed. And once released, that power did not expand gradually. It surged, filling every available channel with a momentum that could not be redirected. This was the moment the war ceased to be about damage inflicted and became about force awakened. The ships sunk at Pearl Harbor could be counted. The aircraft destroyed could be replaced. But the capacity that had just come online, silent for years, now fully engaged, was not something Japan could measure, let alone stop. What had been struck was not America's strength. It was the lock that had kept that strength contained. The next assessments arrived stripped of optimism, reduced to numbers and timelines that no longer bent to interpretation. What had once been projections, carefully hedged, cautiously framed, became calculations. And calculations, once verified, left no room for hope. The language of strategy began to disappear, replaced by the colder language of arithmetic. Weeks, not months. That phrase appeared again and again in revised estimates. Time frames collapsed. Conversion schedules shrank. Where planners had assumed friction, they now found velocity. American production was not ramping up. It was already moving, accelerating so quickly that even conservative models struggled to keep pace. Shipyards that had launched vessels monthly were preparing for weekly output. Some reports suggested even faster cycles once material flows stabilized. Aircraft production figures doubled in projections, then doubled again. What had been considered an upper limit revealed itself as a baseline. The implication was brutal in its simplicity. If ships could be launched faster than they could be sunk, then naval strategy became irrelevant. If aircraft could be produced faster than they could be destroyed, then air superiority was not a battle, it was an inevitability. The room where these numbers were reviewed grew quieter with each update. Officers stopped interrupting. No one argued assumptions anymore. There was nothing to argue. The figures did not care about doctrine or courage or sacrifice. They obeyed only capacity and time. One analyst traced a finger down a column of steel production figures, his voice barely audible as he spoke. America produced more steel in a month than Japan could produce in a year. Petroleum reserves were effectively unlimited by comparison. Automobile factories alone represented an industrial base larger than Japan's entire manufacturing sector. This was no longer a contest of tactics. It was a contest of output. And output favored scale mercilessly. Japan could fight brilliantly, could fight fiercely. It could even fight successfully in isolated engagements. None of that altered the math. Losses could be inflicted, but they would be absorbed. Victories could be won, but they would be diluted by replacement rates that erased their meaning. The war began to feel less like a sequence of battles and more like a countdown. Every day American factories remained online widened the gap. Every hour of uninterrupted production made previous calculations obsolete. The advantage was not growing gradually. It was compounding. Someone finally said what no one wanted to acknowledge. Even perfect tactics won't matter. No one challenged the statement. This was where dread settled in, not as fear of defeat, but as recognition of inevitability. Strategy assumed choice. Arithmetic did not. Once the numbers crossed a certain threshold, outcomes ceased to be influenced by brilliance or bravery. They became foregone. Pearl Harbor had been a shock. The vote had been a revelation. Industrial activation had been alarming. But this was the moment the war revealed its final shape. Not a contest to be decided. A calculation already solved. As the production figures hardened into certainty, the map began to change its meaning. What had once looked like dominance now looked like distance. The colored markers spread across the Pacific. Once symbols of momentum and mastery started to feel thin, fragile, exposed. The very breadth of Japan's success became its quiet undoing. The defensive perimeter had been drawn wide by design. Islands seized, ports captured, sea lanes secured. Each conquest had been justified as necessary depth, a buffer that would force any counterattack to exhaust itself long before reaching the home islands. On paper, it looked elegant, a ring of steel and ocean stretching thousands of miles. But distance cuts both ways. Those outposts required fuel, ammunition, aircraft, replacement crews. Every mile added to the perimeter multiplied the strain on supply lines already stretched to their limit. What had once been interior lines of control became external lines of vulnerability, exposed to a growing enemy whose production was accelerating beyond reach. The victories had come quickly, so quickly that their cost had been easy to ignore. But now each marker on the map demanded protection. Each garrison became a liability. Each captured harbor became a fixed point that could be targeted, bypassed, isolated. Against an enemy limited by scarcity, this strategy might have held. But scarcity was no longer the defining variable. America could afford to choose where to strike, when to strike, and how long to sustain pressure. Japan could not. The perimeter that was meant to deter now invited penetration. It offered targets, not obstacles. The wider it stretched, the more surface area it exposed to an opponent who no longer needed to win everywhere, only anywhere. Officers began to see it, quietly at first, then openly. If America could produce ships faster than Japan could sink them, then blockade became meaningless. If aircraft losses could be replaced indefinitely, then attrition favored only one side. Japan's forces, scattered across islands and coastlines, would be forced to defend everything at once, or abandon positions bought at great cost. Neither option led to security. What made the realization unbearable was that the conquests themselves had not been mistakes. They had been executed with precision, courage, and brilliance. Men had died taking those islands. Plans had succeeded. Objectives had been achieved. And yet, success had laid the trap. The empire now resembled a stretched net rather than a shield, wide, impressive, and incapable of absorbing sustained pressure. The very speed of expansion had outpaced the ability to consolidate, leaving strength dispersed and coordination strained. Victory had not created depth. It had created exposure. As the men studied the map, they understood that the war would not be decided by how much territory Japan controlled, but by how long it could hold territory once the industrial tide began to rise. And on that question, the answer was no longer a matter of courage or skill. It was a matter of time. The triumph that had once inspired confidence now carried a darker meaning. The empire had reached its maximum extent at the exact moment its enemy discovered its full strength. From this point forward, every mile gained would become another mile to defend. And every defense would bring the end closer. The final illusion fell not with a battle, but with a realization. Japan had not entered the war alone, or so it believed. The alliances had looked formidable on paper. Ceremonial signatures, flags aligned, declarations of shared destiny. The Axis was meant to represent balance, a counterweight to the industrial powers of the West. A global realignment, mutual obligation. But when the consequences of Pearl Harbor began to ripple outward, it became clear who had truly benefited. Reports from Manchuria arrived quietly, almost as an afterthought. Soviet forces along the border were not reinforcing. In fact, they were standing down. Units that had been maintained at high readiness for months were being repositioned, their alert levels reduced. There were no preparations for offensive action. No buildup. No tension. The meaning was immediate. By attacking America instead of the Soviet Union, Japan had resolved Stalin's greatest fear. The possibility of a two-front war had vanished overnight. The divisions once pinned in Siberia were now free to move west, toward Germany. Japan's decision had not threatened Moscow, it had reassured it. Stalin was relieved. Across the world, Berlin responded differently but no less revealingly. German leadership welcomed the attack enthusiastically, praising Japan's boldness, celebrating the distraction it would create for the United States. American attention would be drawn across the Pacific. British supply lines might weaken. Europe would gain breathing room. But the enthusiasm carried no weight. There were no offers of material support, no promises of shared production, no coordination of resources. Germany's war was in Europe, and it intended to keep it there. Japan's conflict with America served German interests perfectly, as long as it remained Japan's burden alone. Italy scarcely registered at all, struggling merely to hold its own positions. The truth emerged with brutal clarity. Japan had solved everyone else's strategic problems while creating an unsolvable one for itself. The Soviet Union no longer feared attack from the east. Germany no longer worried about American neutrality. Britain gained an ally with limitless resources entering the war. China saw renewed hope as pressure on Japan's forces intensified. Every major power benefited, except Japan. The alliance that had seemed so imposing now revealed itself as a collection of parallel wars, not a unified front. Each partner pursued its own survival, its own advantage, grateful that Japan had volunteered to absorb the full weight of American mobilization. The misjudgment repeated itself, just on a grander stage. Japan had believed alliances guaranteed support, just as it had believed democracy guaranteed division. In both cases, it mistook appearance for substance. Commitments existed only where interests aligned, and in the Pacific, Japan stood alone. As the map was studied again, it seemed to contract. Not physically, but psychologically. The distances felt shorter. The oceans are less protective. The empire no longer appeared as the eastern pillar of a global coalition, but as a solitary outpost exposed to forces gathering from every direction. Isolation ceased to be political. It became existential. Japan had awakened a giant, stabilized its enemies, and revealed the emptiness of its alliances, all with a single strike meant to secure its future. The war was no longer about winning. It was about enduring alone. The summons arrived with no explanation, written in the careful language that allowed no interpretation and no refusal. The corridors of the palace felt longer than usual as the Prime Minister walked them, each step echoing too clearly against the stone. He had stood before the emperor many times before, confident, composed, armed with plans and projections. This time he carried none of those things. The emperor listened as the reports were delivered. The words sounded correct. Tactical success, strategic initiative, minimal losses. Yet even as they were spoken, they felt detached from reality, like relics from a world that had already ended. When the briefing finished, silence settled over the room, heavy and deliberate. "You appear burdened," the emperor said at last. It was not a reprimand. It was an invitation. The reply came slowly, stripped of formality. The confidence that had guided earlier decisions was gone, replaced by something closer to resignation. The assumptions had been wrong, not miscalculated, misunderstood at their core. America had not been weak. It had been restrained. Its democracy had not been paralyzed by debate. It had been decided. Its industry had not been unready. It had been waiting. The war had been planned around the belief that America would fracture under pressure. Instead, pressure had unified it. The Prime Minister admitted what could not be softened. The attack had not discouraged intervention. It had removed hesitation. The speed of America's response was not an anomaly. It was proof that the arguments Japan had relied upon had already been resolved long before Pearl Harbor. The restraint Japan mistook for incapacity had simply been lifted. The emperor listened without interruption. "What do you recommend?" he asked. For the first time, there was no answer prepared, no adjustment to propose, no alternative path to outline. The war had passed the point where recommendations could redirect it. What had been unleashed was already moving, already compounding, already beyond recall. At last, a response emerged, careful, insufficient, honest. Preparation for a longer conflict. Endurance. Acceptance. They both understood what was left unsaid. This was not guidance. It was an acknowledgement. When the meeting ended, the Prime Minister left with certainty replaced by clarity. The realization that the most decisive moment of the war was already behind them, and it had occurred not in the skies over Pearl Harbor, but in a chamber thousands of miles away, measured not in explosions, but in minutes. After that, the reports were no longer shocking. They accumulated. Industrial output surged past revised expectations. Recruitment lines lengthened instead of thinning. production schedules tightened. Each update confirmed the same conclusion from a different angle. The war was no longer governed by strategy alone. It was governed by math. Numbers replaced debate. Replacement rates outpaced losses. Ship launches exceeded sinkings. Aircraft production erased victories faster than they could be achieved. The gap widened relentlessly, indifferent to courage, sacrifice, or tactical brilliance. What Japan now faced was not merely American power, but American inevitability, industrial capacity aligned with political unity, moving with a momentum that could not be stopped without exhaustion on a scale Japan could not endure. The restraint that had once defined America's posture was gone forever, replaced by commitment that did not require persuasion to sustain itself. The outcome was no longer hidden in the fog of war. It was visible in timetables and ledgers, in shipping manifests and factory shifts. Battles would still be fought. Lives would still be lost. But the direction had already been set. Pearl Harbor destroyed ships, but the 33 minutes destroyed restraint. And once restraint is gone, history stops debating.